And we're live. Good evening. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden.
This is Bishop Enoch, and we are
And
talking
this
about
is,
a book review.
this is, we're going to start doing this every Thursdays. We're going to, just so that we always have our weekend discussion, etc. And so we're adding this because there's a lot of books out there right now. This is a series that you're interested in. Am I correct, Ludika?
Yes, it's called The Translated Texts for Historians, put out by Liverpool University Press, and it's about maybe 90 volumes about it so far. So this is volume one. The whole series basically is of interest to somebody who has an interest in orthodoxy and church history, because most of the volumes are by authors who would be part of the church. Right, because if you deal with the first 1,000 years of history, you can't escape orthodoxy, either east or west. However, the first author we're dealing with, Picatus, who wrote the panegyric to the Emperor Theodosius after the defeat of the supposed usurper Magnus Maximian. Picatus was probably not an Orthodox Christian, but he did write an oration to the Emperor Theodosius, and we're going to talk about that, about the context of it. We're not going to go through the whole book. You can read it. You can if you can't buy a copy of it for whatever reason, you can get a 1 hour borrow copy on Internet Archive.
I'm going to put a link to the Internet Archive on this. Now, tell us a little bit more about this. I've been reading it. I've gone through about half of it. Basically, now this is a panegyric, which for most people, when they think of panegyric speeches, they're usually thought of for the dead. But in this case, in the middle period of the Roman Empire, they were often used in praise of the living. And there was a lot of political background to it. Sometimes there was even, you could find the use of sarcasm or the use of reversed claims to indicate that, say, for example, if you wanted to talk about someone's wickedness, you could talk about how beneficent they were in murdering this many people. That's not what happens in this text, but not much. But the point is that's kind of it was a political speech at the time. So this was important. And
so basically, so Latinius Picantus Depranius was the Latin panegyrist. He was born in the south of France, in the territory of Nunto though he came from Agenium or Agen. He went to a rhetorical school in Bordeaux, where he learned many of the rhetorical works. You can find a lot of this on just any regular search about him. He was at one point a professor, we think, at Bordeaux for rhetoric, and he had attained the rank of proconsul, sort of like governor of Africa, you might say, in 390. That's a little bit later than this. So he was also comes rerum priviterum, or count of the private things of the emperor, sort of like a chamberlain, you might say, all right, of the imperial court. So why did he give this panegyric? Well, to that we have to go through a little history. And I have to admit that reading through the work, I finished it about 2 weeks ago. It was not the most enthralling text. I didn't think it was, but it just has historical importance. Maybe it's much more enthralling if you're hearing it delivered in the imperial senate in Rome or something like that. But
I did think it's interesting. I mean, it's one of the things that it is useful for, even if it's not the most exciting text, is that it is a good idea of the kind of rhetoric that was being used at the time, as well as the kind of speed, the same way we study Toastmasters today, that sort of thing. Yeah. It's a course on speaking and how people spoke in public then.
Exactly. So the context is this. The Emperor Theodosius his forces had recently defeated in battle the forces of the Roman Emperor Magnus Maximus, all right, who claimed to be emperor. There was a dispute. Obviously, this is the problem. The Roman Empire, they didn't at this point in the empire, even in the later Byzantine Empire as the true successor, they didn't really have a strong concept of hereditary succession like they did in Slavic or Germanic areas or Celtic areas, where the son of the king becomes king automatically. That's sort of how it's assumed. Yeah. So how did people become emperor? Well, the Senate and the army sort of said, "Oh, we declare this guy emperor." I mean, it's more complicated than that, but your son wasn't necessarily getting to be made emperor unless you made him co-emperor, and even then, someone could come and challenge it. So,
yeah,
this gentleman fellow called Maximus was born in Galatia, which is in Spain. Okay, he was a Spaniard, a Roman Spaniard, on the estate of Theodosius the Count. All right, who I believe Theodosius the Count was in fact the father of father, I believe, I think he was the father of the Emperor Theodosius the Elder. Okay. Maximus had a distinguished military career. He served under Count Theodosius. When they say count, they don't mean it in the later sense of like a small noble figure. It was sort of like a military commander / governor, because you held multiple positions in the Roman Commonwealth. All right. You just weren't. They didn't have a distinction between civil and military officials necessarily. You were expected to serve in all capacities. So he was a distinguished general. However, what happened was that there was a resistance to in the Western Empire to the expansion of foreign mercenaries and bodyguards into the imperial army, and this provoked a rebellion, all right, of sorts. Gratian, the previous emperor, was I think he was killed in the 380s. Let me see. He was killed in let me get exact. He was killed. He fled the battlefield and was killed at Lyon on August. And okay, so what happens? He's killed. The army in Gaul and in Britain, and I guess the leadership there proclaims the general Magnus Maximus to be the legitimate emperor. Then, all right. The successor of Gratian, the previous emperor, Valentinian II, was only 12. So, this was going to be sort of an issue if he's not going to stop anybody. Anyway, long story short, Maximus does have support in the West. Like St. Martin of Tours, for example, did consider him to be a legitimate emperor. I think St. Ambrose wrote to him. It wasn't like he was just this crazed usurper, all right? He had some importance because he was involved in the suppression of the Priscillian heresy in Spain. The Priscillian was executed under Magnus Maximus, which in fact caused some protests, not because people were defending the Priscillian heresy, but most of the bishops of the church did not believe it was appropriate to execute somebody just for heresy. You just simply excommunicate them, and maybe you kick them out. You kick them out of the church, but don't execute them. So, however, things were coming to an end, and Magnus Maximus was defeated, and I believe let me see, he was defeated in about. Let me just get the details exactly correct. It says Maximus managed to force Emperor Valentinian out of Milan, and he was defeated at Potovio, okay, which is a town in north. I'm sorry, actually, he was defeated. He fell in. I'm sorry. He surrendered in Aquileia after his forces were defeated, and then he was simply executed. All right. So you can read the entire background of it. It's actually interesting. But we're not going to go too much into it since we want to stay with a 30-minute point. And anyway, so the Roman nobility of Gaul wants to exonerate themselves. Why? Well, because, there is evidence they pretty much did support him, Magnus Maximus, and when he became emperor in Gaul and in Britain. And if Theodosius is now the emperor of the entire empire, all right, the sort of the united emperor, and he's in Rome, it's not going to look that great unless they can exonerate themselves. So anyway, Pacatus, I think he is at this time was allowed to give either he was a senator or he's allowed to give a speech in the Senate, and he praises the Emperor Theodosius. He deprecates Maximus. He says basically, he was a usurper. He betrayed your father and your family. He, seized resources from the nobles in Gaul. We didn't really support him, more or less. We went along with it because we were kind of scared of the guy, I guess.
Yeah, he goes into great detail, and he's talking about, he if one would get the impression without the background information that is in the introduction to the book, that this Maximus was just Maximus was just a terrible human being who kind of roamed the earth, destroying everything in his wake. I mean, he really is the panegyric. If it's meant to make Maximus look bad and make Theodosius look good, it's very effective at what it does.
Yes, and of course, again, I bring up the point that there were saints of the church who did not think Maximus was that bad. I mean, they didn't necessarily like everything about him, and I'm not endorsing everything, but he wasn't, how Picatus describes him, as like he wasn't like the devil on earth or something like that. So anyway, the panegyric goes through that. It goes through the defeat of the crime, the probably real as supposed and imagined crimes, and exaggerated of Maximus, his defeat, his treachery. The view is that he was a servant of the Theodosian family. He betrayed them, although there is some evidence to support the idea that Maximus didn't think he was betraying the Theodosian family, that he was just the legitimate emperor in the West, and he could. And I mean, ideally, it's possible that if he had arranged a better situation, he could have been recognized by Theodosius I. It's just not what happened. So. Now, there are some curiosities of the speech that do tell us that Picatus was more than likely simply not a Christian. He was still one of the old pagan oligarchy or aristocracy that existed in the Roman Senate at the time. One is he talks about the divinity of the emperor. Well, obviously, the emperor Saint Theodosius is a saint, and he was an Orthodox Christian, and Theodosius did not accept the idea that the emperor was divine. All right. Picatus talks about the will of the gods. All right, so obviously not a statement Christians would accept. He does speak occasionally about the supreme being or the supreme creator, but many pagans did have sort of a concept that there was sort of this transcendent supreme creator, and the Roman pantheon existed under him, or maybe they were like manifestations of him or whatever, or something like that.
Now, it is worthy of note that the editor of the text does argue that they make a kind of muted argument that the speaker is a Christian, even though I did see what you're referring to. Yes. It does not sound like he is.
I read that part of it. I simply don't think it's a very good argument to make.
No.
Though I understand what they're trying to say. So that's basically the text. Do you have any specific questions, Father Joseph? Things you want
no,
to talk
about? I was reading it. I'm in the middle of it, as I mentioned. I'm at around page 40. It's really pretty short. It's around 130 pages. I started reading it yesterday. I found it very interesting. But here's my big question, and I think that this is important because this establishes kind of where we're going with the show. How does this segue into other texts? You mentioned there were patristic texts, but obviously this is not one of them. But this is the first in a series. So tell us a little more about what we're going to be expecting on future Thursdays.
So the next text, I believe, in Volume 2 of the Translated Text for Historians is St. Gregory of Tours' Vita Patrum, or Life of the Fathers. Okay. There was a previous translation made by Platina back around 1979, but that was made from a French text, and a French text that had been translated from Latin, but they translated into English. I believe
so it's like a tertiary translation. So it's not.
Yeah, I mean, there was. I think they may have compared it with some Latin texts, or what have you. But the translated for historians text, translated text for historians contains a translation directly from the Latin text. So,
okay, cool.
Then the volume after that, I believe, is St. Gregory of Tours' Life of the Martyrs.
Okay.
And then the Life of the Confessors.
We're going to have a lot. So there's a lot more that's going to be coming. Go on. Please tell me.
So, and then eventually we're going to, if we can continue this for 90 episodes, we will get to some very it'll be increasingly more and more interesting than a speech by a Roman panegyrist about exaggerating the crimes of the guy who he probably served. And as interesting as that is, and the whole political sphere of it,
you're right. It's not the main purpose of what we're doing here.
But I do think there are some points to make about this. One is that if you read, let's say, a patristic panegyric, okay, there. I mean, I hate to use the word exaggeration, okay, but there are ways of speaking that are true from your perspective, but not necessarily from another person's perspective. I don't mean to say it like, truth isn't objective or what have you. For example, we may read, let's say not necessarily in a panegyric, but we may read a speech, or let's say a panegyric in honor of St. Cyril of Alexandria, okay, in which it talks about Nestorius as the worst human being possible. And let's say somebody knew Nestorius, are like, well, I don't believe he was this, constantly, monstrous figure. Well, the question really is from the divine perspective, which the Father spoke from, okay? Even if Nestorius, if you had known him, you're like, oh, he's not really that bad of a guy, even if he was wrong about his opinions. That's not really what they're talking about, because heresy is considered monstrously evil, all right? And even if a figure like Arius or Nestorius weren't, I think they really were bad, but let's say they were just some follower of a heretic that were mistaken. The purpose of it is to impress upon people the monstrous evils that they were promoting, all right? So in the same sense, I think you could probably look upon Picatus' speech, although I still would not, consider the fathers of the church to have engaged anywhere near the adulatory attitude to living powers he has. In fact, you do find reactions, and let's say among the Latin fathers, to this late Latin panegyric attitude. St. Maximus, the Bishop of Turin, for example, who reposed around 450. He may have been like 100 when he died. He lived an extended life. And in fact, tonight after Vespers, we read the homily by St. Maximus of Turin for the feast of St. John, Nativity of St. John the Baptist. So St. Maximus and St. Eusebius, St. Eusebius of Vercelli, they talk about do not praise a man when he's still alive. And they were speaking in direct contradiction to someone like Picatus and other Latin panegyrists. Because as St. Eusebius of Vercelli talks about, I think we're St. Maximus about St. Eusebius, don't praise the sailors in the midst of their, they're in the midst of the storm and they're trying to get the ship to shore. Don't praise them before they've come safely into harbor. Don't praise the general in the midst of the battle when things could still turn horribly wrong. And in fact, I believe the Book of Wisdom says praise a man. It's safer to praise a man when he's dead than when he's alive, because you're not going to create pride in him. And this is something that St. Augustine just talked about, the wider problems that existed in the Latin society at the time that the church had to fight against.
Correct.
One of the problems St. Augustine talks about was that pride. This was a big issue among the Latin peoples. You can see among the Greek peoples too, but he's dealing specifically with the Romans. But even when a Roman power or politician would do something right, he did it almost as a way of self-aggrandizement. So let's say he distributes grain to the poor in a district. He's not doing it necessarily because he's like, oh, this is the moral thing to do. He's doing it because he could be viewed as magnanimous.
Appearances.
Yes, exactly. And the fathers saw this as extremely deadly. People were striving for political office simply for the sake not of serving the commonwealth, or primarily should be of serving God, all right? But they were doing it simply for their own aggrandizement and self-justification. And the church did not accept those as legitimate means to do that. So, in that sense, the panegyric before the emperor, one wonders what the Emperor St. Theodosius himself, sitting in the Senate Hall, would have thought. He may have, for political reasons, said, look, I'm going to have to let this guy talk, even if I don't necessarily agree with everything he's saying in it, because I need the support of the Western aristocracy, because they just rebelled against me and my family.
Yeah.
So
there's also just the fact that being of noble birth, etc., he would have been well versed in understanding keeping up appearances.
Yes.
And so, despite how disparate this
text,
what's the word I'm looking for? This speech that's so flattering was before him, he would have also been aware of the seriousness of the events that had previously just transpired.
Yes.
So he would have. I think he would have understood this is really political.
And remember, there's a background to this with the Roman Senate. And the background is that what was called the Altar of Victory which existed in I can't remember if it existed in a building attached. It was a pagan altar to the goddess Victoria, I believe. Either it was in a temple, a small temple shrine attached to the Senate House. By the way, the Roman Senate House still exists in Rome to this day. You can look it up. Or it was in the middle of the Senate building, like in the middle of the Senate hall. So one of the emperors had removed it as offensive to, and the Senate, and so, but one of the successive emperors after him, maybe it was Julian the Apostate, I believe, kind of restored the altar of victory. So St. Ambrose is engaged almost coterminous with these events in a battle with Symmachus, who was the sort of leader of the conservative pagan aristocracy, who wanted to maintain the altar of victory, who wanted to, they had been restored by one of the emperors, they were going to keep it. So St. Ambrose was saying, no, if we're going to be a Christian state, we cannot allow even the old conservative, I hate to use the word reactionary because that has political implications, but this old pagan aristocracy to maintain control of the institutions. And so, if it's interesting if you read the letter of Symmachus, between Symmachus and St. Ambrose, because Symmachus at one point says, oh, we all believe in the great mystery, who knows, almost like a modern sort of like perennialist liberal, what have you. So that's sort of the background. The Senate wasn't necessarily completely in the hands of the Orthodox at this point. There may have been Arians also in the Senate, and not just pagans. And the Arians and the pagans tended to ally if they could both, turn over the Orthodox position, attack them. So, like you said, Saint Theodosius realizes that there are problems in Rome itself with the aristocracy. Even if in the countries, even if in places like Gaul and Britain, you do have almost a largely or entirely Orthodox population, almost like in Spain. Paganism sort of existed in certain areas, but it was already defeated and dying out. You still had to deal with the aristocracy in Rome. So I think that's probably the context of allowing Pacatus to speak, who evidently was one of those older conservative. He was conservative, but conservative in the sense of culture. All right, because obviously orthodoxy, the Orthodox Christian worldview can appear conservative or non-conservative on your view. I mean, obviously, we're for what is right and what should be done, even if a immoral position or evil position has maintained power for 200 or 300 years. We're not going to care about the tradition if it's evil. All right.
Yeah, it's like
our tradition is a tradition of the fathers and of the saints. All right.
Yeah, it's like the whole the conservative movement, and we've talked about this in the past, seems to be basically preserving what was liberalism 25 years ago. And so in that sense, our position isn't old or new. It's simply the Christian position. And when it comes up to something like stuff like sodomy, our position remains unchanged. It's just how we express it may change over time depending on how the state, and really that shouldn't have even happened.
Because the church is always going to be against sodomy, abortion, these fundamental immoralities, and and what was happening. And so obviously we're going to have to speak of the wider context of the book, the events happening. At this point, the Emperor St. Theodosius, as with previous Christian emperors, beginning with St. Constantine, were passing laws that were gradually enshrining orthodoxy more and more into the position it needed to be in the Commonwealth. And these included laws against the various immoralities, against abortion. I mean, there were laws against abortion, I think, by the late 2nd and mid-3rd century that were sort of kind of quasi-laws by some of the Stoic emperors, maybe some of the other ones.
Well, they weren't blatantly though.
No, I think they were more popular. They were more measures to increase the population more than anything else.
Yeah,
it's sort of like you can look about Stalin or Mao had laws against abortion, but not because they believed in the sanctity of life from the conception. They just wanted there to be more people, and it was a pure utilitarian concern. And if your morality is based upon, I don't know, Marxist utilitarianism or something like that, it's not going. It can just flip on a dime.
It's not going to
which happened in those countries, by the way. All right. So in the wider context, the church is in a battle with not just the heretics, but with the older, gradually dying pagan ruling class to ascendancy. And we're fighting our way up. Saint Theodosius was, I think, the great key in all of this. He was the last emperor of the Western. He was the last emperor of the United Empire, East and West together. So, unless we want to go through the entire text, there's not much more to talk about. Unless you have.
Yeah, I mean, we can leave the last 5 minutes up for any questions about this or future shows of this type. If people are wondering why I'm smacking myself in the head, it's because I have these earbuds, but I'm not really used to them. So if they keep falling out, and so if it looks like I'm trying to save them, that's part of the reason why. But in any case, yeah, no, I think that this was a good overview for kind of. It's not a test run because it is a real volume. And what is this series called again?
The translated text for historians. Okay. By Liverpool University Press. Now they have a separate series called Translated Text for Byzantinists, which has about 9 volumes. That one has some of the works of Saint Gregory Palamas and the Council, the so-called Ninth Ecumenical Council. Translated text great. There. There's some other Byzantine materials are translated.
So we have a whole bunch of translated text to be reviewed.
Yeah, they're going to get more interesting for Orthodox people as time goes on.
Yeah.
We're going to get to eventually, I think and obviously this will be an introductory episode, so we're going to talk about other things. One of the things we're going to get to eventually, maybe, who knows how fast, the work on the Memorial of the Saints, or the Memorial of the Martyrs, I believe, by St. Eulogius of Cordoba. Or St. Eulogius of Toledo, depending on what you call him. And which is an interesting work because it happened in the midst of the 9th century, in which Spain was largely under Islamic domination. And what happened was that the Orthodox in Spain simply resisted the Islamic attempts to suppress them and for them not to talk publicly about the Christian faith. And you had people like St. Eulogius and others who publicly were preaching not just in the churches, but outside the churches, and the attempt to convert, and they successfully did convert many Muslims. All right. And, the reaction that happened to that and such. And there are other interesting books we'll get to, like the minutes of the text of the Third Ecumenical Council, which was the first there. This is the first, they have the first English translation of it. Before that, you had the Erdmann series, which had sort of sections of the Third Council and the Fourth Council and the Fifth Council translated. But Liverpool University Press, they're the ones that translate the entire text, like 300, 400-page books. All right, that includes the minutes of these councils and so forth. And then eventually, some of the last volumes deal with the letters between the early Carolingian rulers and the popes, which bear importance, I believe. So a lot of important texts we're going to get to. There'll be much more meat to talk about than, again, an important panegyric within its context, but a lot of it's fluff, to be honest, in the text. So I'm looking forward to that, and we will, I guess, convene here next Thursday, hopefully. In the meantime...
okay. We have a question, and I think it shouldn't take too long, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
Aaron asks, what is y'all's opinion on the Ante-Nicene Fathers series? I only ask because I have all 9 volumes now, and I was surprised of how much fluff is in it, Gnostic texts and Second Temple Jewish works.
He's talking about the 9 volumes of the Erdmann series.
Is that the Erdmann series that he's referring to?
Yeah, I think, let me look it up. Hold on. Let me look up the Tertullian.org site.
Yeah.
Go through it real quick. Sort of sounds familiar. I think I know what he's talking, like the Clementine recognitions, a few other. Let's see. Okay, so you're probably talking about what? Volumes 8 and 10, maybe. I mean, be a little bit more specific. See, volume 1 is the Apostolic Fathers, was Clement of Rome, Methetes, Polycarp, Ignatius, Barnabas.
Yeah, that's all good.
Okay. Volume 2 is Fathers of the 2nd century, Shepherd of Hermas, Theophilus, Athenagoras, Clement of Alexandria. It does have Tatian, who later left the church. Volume 3 and Volume 4 are Tertullian entirely, with a little bit of Origen. So obviously a mixed bag there. But they weren't Gnostics. Volume 5 is St. Hippolytus, St. Cyprian, Caius. There's also Novatian, who later left the church. Volume 6 is St. Gregory Thaumaturgus, St. Dionysius the Great, Julius Africanus, Anatolius, Methodius, and Arnobius. I think all of those were Orthodox writers. Volume 7 is Lactantius, Venantius, Asterius, Victorinus, Dionysius, the Apostolic Constitutions, Homilies, Liturgies. Most of that's generally all right. Volume 8 is a text called the 12 Patriarchs. This looks like it's more. That might be Second Temple material, the 12 Patriarchs.
Yeah,
I can't quite remember.
Like
Theodotus, I think Theodotus was a translator from Hebrew into Greek of certain Old Testament text. There are materials attributed to St. Clement of Rome. They might be his. The Pseudo-Clementine text. Then he might be talking about the Apocrypha. See, here's what he's perhaps speaking about. Volume 8 contains the Apocrypha of the New Testament. Things like the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Gospel Pseudo-Matthew, the Gospel Nativity of Mary, History of Joseph the Carpenter, Gospel of Thomas. Now, a lot of this is a mixed bag, all right? Because obviously the church makes use of the Proto-Evangelium of James, all right?
Right.
I think the Gospel Pseudo-Matthew may be sort of like the Proto-Evangelium of James, I think. Gospel of Thomas is obviously a Gnostic text, I believe. There's the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is not Gnostic. It's simply like the Acts of Pilate, the descent of Christ into hell. So I obviously can't comment. Then there's it gives the false decretals also, by the way.
Oh, really?
I think these are the false decretals. Hold on, let me look.
Wow.
It says the learned editors of the Edinburgh series have given us only a specimen of these frauds. Yeah, this is part of the false decretals. Well, I mean, I still think some of that's useful simply from a historical perspective. I mean, you may not be interested in it. That's fine. But anyway, what I'd say is most of those 9 volumes or 10 volumes generally has useful material, directly useful from an Orthodox Christian perspective. The material that is Gnostic, if you can't decide, if you can't figure out what's not good and what's not bad, the introductions of these Protestant editors, even from the 1880s, generally would tell you if it was a Gnostic or non-Gnostic work. If you're not interested in it, just don't read it. I mean, that's that's how. Now, my view is I generally read all the texts because I want to know, not because I'm endorsing the heretical material, but I want to know what the heretics are saying so I can reply to them. And I can tell you, I remember years, just an anecdote, like 20 years ago, there was a Newsweek or something, and it had an article about a rediscovered fragment from Nag Hammadi of the Gospel according to Judas or something like that. That's what they called it. Wow. It wasn't really called that in the text. And it said, according to this text, Judas was collaborating with Christ to do everything, and he's really the hero. And these are new revelations. I was like, wait. These aren't new revelations. St. Irenaeus of Lyons, in his Against Heresy, says, and there are these crazy Gnostics who wrote this text in a vision of tribute saying the same exact stuff. It's like a lot of these newer publications, like Elaine Pagels, who's like this queen of Gnosticism of sorts. They sort of want to act like they're up against the patriarchy and the establishment, quote unquote, the church, whatever they really mean by that. And everything they can find in these Gnostic texts, by the way, Father Joseph, the church fathers explained exactly what the Gnostics were teaching. They said, this is what Marcion teaches. This is what Ptolemy teaches. This is what so-and-so teaches.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, this stuff has just been I think especially that the whole Judas working with Jesus thing, that's been popularized again by the Kazantzakis' Last Temptation, and that was put in the book and movie. I think it's one of the stupider hypotheses that are out there, but again, modern people want a modern, and they just will look for the stupidest thing they can find.
But just quickly, one more anecdote too. So we do talk a little bit more about the book for just one more minute. When they had the Priscillian heresy in Spain, Priscillian to Avila, okay, and he taught outwardly Priscillianism presented itself as orthodox, but they had an inward secret teaching, all right. And the Spanish bishops and some of the Gallic bishops gathered at a synod that was chaired by Magnus Maximus, who we're talking about, in which obviously they condemned it as a heresy. And St. Martin of Tours was at this synod. And St. Martin of Tours went there because he was afraid that there were people saying they wanted to create sort of this... everything all right?
I'm just checking. Give me a second.
Okay. Okay. So St. Martin of Tours was at the synod, and basically he spoke to the emperor Magnus Maximus, and he said that he has no problem agreeing to the anathematization of Priscillian, but he objects to this idea that they're going to start searching through all the Spanish churches and like torturing people to find out who's really a Priscillian or not, because Priscillians sort of were believed that they could lie to preserve their true teaching. All right, which is obviously a problem. So St. Martin's position was that, look, if you ask people, lay people, do they condemn Priscillian, and do they renounce these heresies? If they say yes, unless you have any other evidence, you got to accept their word on it. You can't start torturing people because you're going to, the wheat and the tares. You can destroy everything. All right. It doesn't mean he was against heresy, but it had to be public and it had to be proven. So St. Martin agreed to co-consecrate a bishop at the synod. He did. He signed his name to the document. He agreed to co-consecrate the bishop. However, he learned in the midst of the I think right before it or in the midst of this consecration service, that the Ephachius and some of the other bishops with Magnus Maximian had decreed the execution of Priscillian, being burned at the stake, which is like the first time that ever happened. All right. I mean, pagan Romans burned people at the stake for things and such. So St. Martin was so disgusted at the fact that they had lied to him about it that he refused to put his name on the consecration certificate for the new bishop. He just simply left. All right. And according to Severus, his biographer, he was walking through the woods. He was so upset that all these people, that this was going to happen, that an angel came to St. Martin and told him that he had actually saved the lives of a lot of people in Spain, because Magnus Maximus had agreed that he was only going to stop with executing Priscillian and a few other people, but nothing more. And he did keep his word. All right. Whereas if St. Martin hadn't shown up and hadn't made this big
protest, killed everyone.
There would have been a lot more people falsely accused of Priscillian heresy and executed. So, obviously, and you do find in the life of St. Martin of Tours and in his biographer Severian, positive views of Magnus Maximus. They didn't view him entirely as a bad guy. So that's an example of how you could have one author say something like Placatus, just throw this guy completely into the bus. But St. Martin Severian, their position is more nuanced, that, he shouldn't have condemned Priscillian to death, although he did that at the instigation of some of the other bishops. But he had his good side too. So, all right.
Okay, so
no other questions.
No, I don't see any other questions. Aaron did say thanks, which I put up here, and but outside of that, there were no other questions. As I said, we're going to be doing a book review like this every Thursday, and of course, we're going to be doing our weekend show, which is considerably longer. So just as I mentioned, I hope everyone is having a good end of the fast. We're almost there now.
And a happy feast to St. John the Baptist, the Nativity of St. John, which we're beginning tonight.
Amen. The feast for that. And so everyone have a great night, and thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon.
Yeah, thanks be to God.
Amen.